All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for joining us today to talk about conservation for North Carolina's nature and people. We'll be introducing two new online tools. My name is Katie Warnell. I'm a Senior Policy Associate at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University. I'm joined by Lydia Olander, who directs the Ecosystem Services Program at the Institute, and Chris Canfield, the Executive Director of Conservation Trust for North Carolina. We're going to start off with some context about these tools, and then we'll jump into some walkthroughs and scenarios for how they can be used. And then we'll save some time at the end for a Q&A session. So if you have questions or comments throughout the presentation, please go ahead and put them into the Q&A box, which you can open at the bottom of your screen. And that way we'll be able to collect all those questions in one place. And for that Q&A session, we'll also be bringing on Israel Golden, who's a recent Duke grad who built these tools in Google Earth Engine in case anyone has more technical questions. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Lydia to get us started.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So I just want to give a little background. This work all began to support the state's climate adaptation and resiliency planning in 2019. Stakeholders and state agencies wanted to include ways to reduce carbon through capture and storage in forests and natural systems. But having recently experienced some significant hurricane impacts, they also were interested in using our investments in nature to adapt to climate change and enhance resilience for our communities, lands, and waters. And while there was a pretty good national approach to identify and quantify carbon reduction and storage benefits from natural and working lands, we didn't have the same kind of information for resilience benefits. And so a few of the working groups that were initiated with experts from the state and from around Duke worked together to develop feasible methods for a state level analysis and state level maps, which were then implemented and used to support the recommendations in the state natural working lands action plan. All the methods and maps were shared publicly and were available for downloading, and they still are. Next slide. A story map was created to make it easier to understand what all these different data are and where they come from and how they might be useful. And we also had an opportunity recently to take advantage of this data across the state to create a common approach for quantifying natural and working lands benefits across the state, which was supported by state agencies, land trusts, and other partners. So we created, we updated the data for all of the different resilience benefits that these lands provide, and created a state level online dashboard that can be used to track conservation, carbon, and other benefits of natural and working lands benefits over time. And this can be done at a watershed or at a county level. And while these we think, are valuable contributions to understanding the data and state of natural and working lands benefits across the state, the data were not yet in forms that we thought could be easily used by conservation managers on the ground. And today we're going to talk about some tools that have just been released that are designed for these particular uses. So what we think makes this work valuable contribution for conservation and natural resources management in North Carolina are two things. First, we're expanding the land conservation and management objectives to include climate mitigation and resilience benefits that may open up new funding opportunities. And second, we are using a common set of data and measures across the entire state to make more coordinated management decisions and to make it easier to track a common set of outcomes. At least that's what we hope. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thanks. And so I'm with the Conservation Trust for North Carolina, the executive director, and as a participant in the natural and working lands conversations, it became apparent that those of us working day to day trying to say take a plot of land and put it into multiple benefit uses, that we also didn't have the data. And so seeing what the Duke Nicholas Institute folks had put together really sort of spawned the idea that there may be a way to go deeper on this. And so we worked together to come up with some proposals to get funding to put together essentially what started out as sort of a single tool that then evolved into multiple tools that you're going to see today. We think it begins to answer the needs of not just land trusts across the state, and we have many in North Carolina doing great work, but also statewide land conservation And maybe many other of you who don't fit into those categories. Maybe you're working with a private landowner, or you're looking at parks in your community. So we think that there are ways, even beyond what we originally envisioned, that these tools could be used. Next slide. But it was really important for us to do this in a way that answered the needs of the original group that we were talking to. And so we did some survey work as background before we started developing the tools. And what you see in front of you is really the outcome of that survey. The light gray blue represents those topics where people really said, I want to figure out how to include this more, but I'm just not really sure how to do that. And so again, we weren't trying to replace existing tools that people already use, GIS-based systems for their conservation planning. Rather, we wanted to supplement that in a way that allowed us to talk about and see multiple benefits at the same time. And as Lydia said, that can help with your fundraising as more diverse approaches to conservation funding emerge. I also think it can help make your case with your own community, with your donors and supporters, and with your legislative team as we go forward and want to get more funding to protect the things that we care about. So having the ability to see it all in one place and then make it a comparison among different plots of land we may be considering, we think will be very useful.
Thanks, Chris. So we developed two tools, as Chris introduced. The first one we call the prioritization tool. This helps you to identify the HUC 12 level watersheds in North Carolina that best meet the conservation benefits that are most of interest to you and your organization. So this is more of a high level screening tool to find the parts of the state that might be best for you for your future work. And then the second tool we call the benefits calculator. This is a more specific tool for specific parcels of land, and this will calculate benefit metrics for an area of land that you select. So before I actually open up these tools, I just want to show you what metrics and what data are going into them. So Chris showed you that graph that has a list of different conservation benefits that we heard were of interest and not currently included in conservation planning in North Carolina. And so we focused on trying to identify data sets, again, primarily pulling from work that we'd already done with the Natural Working Lands group that were related to those particular interests. So we have 7 different types of benefits listed here. Many of them have multiple metrics. So for example, for carbon storage and sequestration, we have one metric related to how much carbon is currently standing in forests, and a second metric that looks at total potential forest carbon sequestration going forward in time. I want to especially draw attention to the last 2 rows here. So the second to last row is the probability of future development. This is not a benefit in itself, but it makes conservation to preserve the other benefits more important if it's on land that has a high probability of being developed in the future, since development loses many of these benefits. And then the final one is the demand for downstream flood attenuation. We've heard lots of interest throughout the Natural Working Lands process about the need for more flooding information, which is challenging to do at the state level. So what we were able to do for these tools, well, actually just for one of the tools, was to include a watershed scale metric. And so this metric is only included in the prioritization tool because it is at the watershed level. It's not available to be calculated for individual parcels, but it looks at the area of developed land that's in the active river area, which we're using as a proxy for the floodplain. So it's therefore likely to be at risk for flooding. That's downstream of each of the watersheds in the state. So this just tells you where in the state you might want to focus that is in need of this downstream flood protection. So other than that downstream flood attenuation metric, all of the other data sets feed into both of the tools, but the information is treated differently in the 2 tools. In the prioritization tool, we're combining information from multiple metrics to get an overall score that's used in the prioritization. And so we wanted to be comparing apples to apples and have kind of the same range of values for each of those metrics. And so for that reason, what we do is we take each metric and then we give each of the watersheds a score from 1 to 100 for that metric. So it's a relative range so that the watershed that has, for example, the greatest forest carbon stock would get 100 for that particular metric. The watershed with the lowest forest carbon stock would get a 1, and everything else would be in between. So that just allows us to add them together and do that prioritization in a more consistent way. The benefits calculator, on the other hand, will provide the total or the mean score for each metric. and that's going to be reported for the area of interest that you define. So that doesn't do any of that standardization. It's just going to report in the different units for each metric that are shown in this table. All right, so I think that's enough background. We're going to jump into some tool walkthroughs. So just a minute while I switch over to sharing my web browser. So these are both web-based tools. At the end of today's presentation, we'll put the links for both in the chat in case you haven't seen them yet. But they're available in a web browser. It all runs in the cloud, so you don't need to open your GIS or work with the data directly. And we think that's one reason these will be useful is just that they're quick and easy to run. They don't require that level of expertise. So I'm going to quickly walk through both of the tools just to show you how they work, what decisions you'll have to make to use them, and what the outputs look like. We'll start with the Conservation Prioritization Tool. So when you first open this tool, you'll get this map that shows all of these 12 watersheds in the state outlined in blue. And then all of the choices that you'll have to make to run this tool are in this panel to the left. So the first choice is whether you want to include or exclude land that's already protected from your prioritization. The default here is to exclude land that's already protected. That's because we anticipate that most people coming to this tool will be looking for new land to protect. And so you want to know where there is land that's not already protected that has all of this conservation value. You can change it if you'd like to include land that is protected. Doing that will cause areas like the mountains that are very highly protected to score really high, which might not be as useful if you're looking for new land to protect, but that's an option if you'd like to change it. The second choice is about your area of interest. So you have a few different ways you can run this tool. Right now it's set to run for the entire state, so it will prioritize all of the watersheds in North Carolina relative to each other. But we heard when we did our surveys and workshops that Chris mentioned that in many cases, organizations are working at the smaller geography within the state. So if that's the case for you, you can select a smaller area by choosing river basins or by choosing counties that you work in. You can choose multiple counties or multiple river basins. You can also choose to define your own geometry, which basically just lets you draw on the map the area that you'd like to include. We'll keep using the entire state for right now. And then most of this sidebar is devoted to specifying the data layers that you'd like to include. So this is the part of the tool where you can decide what is important to you or your organization, what you'd like to keep in that prioritization. So you'll see each of the metrics from the table that I showed you is listed here, and they each have their own slider underneath them. So anything that has a slider that's set to greater than 0 will be included in the prioritization. Anything that has a 0 won't be included at all. And if you have certain metrics that you want to be counted more than others, you can change this to be higher than 1. So if we made standing forest carbon a 2, it would be we counted twice as much as anything else in the model, but we'll leave it at 1 for now. So we're going to run this with forest carbon and carbon sequestration potential, and biodiversity and climate resilience as the benefits that we're interested in. And the final decision is about the number of priority HUCs that will be shown in the results graph. So you'll see what this looks like in a minute, but basically the output will highlight a certain number of the top scoring watersheds. I've got it set to 5. The default is 3 if you don't put anything in the box. And those will be summarized in some graphs that show up as well. So once you're done making all your decisions here, you just click the Run Scenario button. It'll take a few seconds to run. It is faster if you're not doing the whole state because it doesn't have to do as much math, not as many watersheds to include, but it is usually pretty quick even for the whole state. All right, so there it goes. We've got our updated map. So these are still showing all the HUCs, but now they are being rated based on the benefits that you selected. So the HUCs that are in yellow and kind of the yellow greens are scoring high, and the HUCs that are blue are scoring the lowest. You can zoom in and look at individual HUCs like this. It just takes it a second to redraw. And if we zoom in here, we can see it's going to outline the top scoring HUCs, which is this bright yellow one is the top scoring HUC in purple. So that's where that 5 came in. It's going to outline the top 5. You can get information on individual HUCs by clicking on this Explore Attributes button and then clicking on a HUC. You get this whole little pop-up with its name and basically information for all of the metrics that are listed on the left-hand side there. And then on the right-hand side, you get a set of charts. So again, this is showing the top 5, and it's comparing the top 5 HUCs on each of the benefits. So this is a nice way to be able to compare them. There might be some differences in terms of what each of them is scoring high on that kind of compensates. So for example, when we look at this third top scoring one, it actually is the highest of all of them in terms of how much carbon it currently has stored in its forests, but it scores lower in terms of potential for future forest carbon sequestration. And there's quite a number of these if you keep scrolling down. You are also able to open any of them if you'd like, pop it out if you want to see it bigger, and then you can download either the data that's going into that, or you can download it as an image to use, for example, in a presentation. And if you keep scrolling all the way to the bottom, there's also a data table. So if you'd like to download this information to, for example, incorporate into your desktop GIS, you can again open this table by itself and then download it as a CSV. It has the HUC12 code, so you can match that up to a HUC12 shapefile in your desktop GIS if you'd like. But again, you don't need to know how to use desktop GIS in order to use these tools. I think the last thing to point out here is just that if you prefer a different map background, there are a few options up here to see satellite data or kind of a standard street map. All right, so that's the prioritization tool. I'm going to jump over to the benefits calculator, which is a much, oops, that's not it. Here it is, which is a much simpler tool. It really only has one option for you to decide, and it looks a little different as well. So the first thing you'll notice when you open it is it's showing one of the underlying data layers. Right now it's showing standing carbon. Again, yellow is higher, areas with higher carbon out in the mountains, but you can turn that off. You can explore any of the individual data layers if you'd like. And again, you can change up here on the right what the map looks like. But all you need to do to run the benefits calculator is to decide your area of interest. There are 2 different ways you can do this. You can use an uploaded shapefile, and we have a little instructional page here. If you click on this link, that will tell you how to upload a shapefile to Google Earth Engine. If you haven't done it before, it will take a few minutes to get it set up, but it's not very complicated, definitely doable. Or again, you can draw on the map. So you can zoom in. I find the satellite view really helpful for this. Zoom in a little bit north of Durham. You find some nice forest up here. So you can zoom in and then go ahead and draw your polygon. So I'm going to do this really quickly. Again, just an example, so it's going to be a little messy, but you just keep clicking here on the outside and then re-click on your first point, and there's my polygon. So if I wanted to get information for this particular polygon, you just scroll down to the bottom and click on the calculate button. It'll take a couple seconds to do the results. Again, it will take longer if you're doing a larger area. And then you'll get this pop-up on the right. So this table is your summary of benefits for your area of interest. It has a little bit of general information. So the total area at the top here, about 340 acres for the little shapes that I drew. And then it will have that area's scores on each of the other metrics. So this area looks like it definitely has some forest carbon and potential forest carbon sequestration. It actually doesn't really score very well on anything, any of the other metrics. So it wasn't a very good example area that I picked. But again, really easy to reset this. Maybe go look for a different area. Or if you have a shapefile that you've uploaded, again, you can use that. So we do have one built in here that is the Duke campus, just as an example, that we can calculate as well. So here's what it looks like if you do a shapefile. It will again show you what your area of interest looks like, and you'll get your scores over here. And then this is an example of why I find it useful to look at some of these layers. So for example, the Duke forest or the Duke campus doesn't have much carbon happening in a lot of it because it has buildings, but you can see by turning on these different layers where that carbon sequestration potential and standing carbon actually is. You could see if it has any good biodiversity areas, looks like mostly along the streams, and just start to understand a little bit better how these different benefits are distributed throughout the property that you're looking at. All right, let's switch back to slides. All right, so I know that was a pretty quick walkthrough of those 2 tools. So in order to provide a resource, if anyone would like to revisit some of these examples or read about some of the choices that you're making in running the tools, we do have a user's guide. It's built on the StoryMap platform. And so it has some really nice little videos kind of showing what happens if you use the tools in different ways. It also has a lot more detail about the metrics and where the data for those metrics comes from. All right, so just from watching some of those walkthroughs, you might have started to have some ideas for how this information might be useful for your organization, whether that's a land trust or a state or local government agency or some other kind of organization that's interested in land conservation in North Carolina. But just to kind of get the juices flowing, I wanted to introduce a few short scenarios to illustrate some of the ways that we think these tools could be helpful for different types of users. So our first example, our user is a state agency that has some funding to distribute. So it's designing an RFP for conservation projects, specifically looking for projects that will have carbon and ecosystem resilience benefits. And this is a new program they're designing, so they're interested in identifying parts of the state that they might want to request projects be located in that are most likely to support those benefits. And they're also interested in whether there's a way to compare projects that are proposed for funding in a standardized way without asking the people developing the projects to go through a lot of time and effort in developing that proposal. So if we jump back to the tools, we can quickly show how these tools might be useful for answering those types of questions. So for the first question about where in North Carolina they might want to work, we can run this prioritization tool, and we've already done this for the entire state, since they don't know yet what part of the state they might want to work in. And they're most interested in carbon and ecosystem resilience benefits. So we've highlighted the 2 carbon metrics, and then a few metrics related to ecosystem resilience. We've got connectivity and biodiversity, as well as climate resilience. And when we run that, again, the yellow and kind of yellow-green areas score the highest. I see some of the watersheds and large river basins in North Carolina start to pop out. So the Cape Fear's got a lot of yellow going on, the Roanoke, and then the New River Basin as well up here in the Northwest. So that might be a starting point for where we'd like to look for projects for this particular proposal. It could also be useful, having made that decision, to encourage applicants who are developing projects to use this tool to look for places where they might want to look for projects within some of those river basins. So if we switch this to river basin and run it just for the Cape Fear, we can zoom in and get a little bit more detailed information about what parts of that particular river basin might be good targets for projects. So when we look there, it looks like mostly the lower part of the basin is where it's really lighting up. And then the second part of the state agency's question was about easily comparing proposed projects. So here's where the benefits calculator, I think, could really come in handy as a tool for people as they're putting their proposals together. So as an example here, I've zoomed in to the lower Cape Fear near Elizabethtown and White Lake. So here's the Cape Fear River down here. Someone developing a project could easily play around with a few different project areas. They could draw them on here really quickly if they don't have shapefiles they want to upload, and then get this summary of benefits for that area of interest. And if everyone who's submitting a project would include this information that comes from this tool, they'll all be from a consistent source. It's quick and easy for the applicants to pull that together. They'll give the state agency a way to easily compare projects on some of these metrics that they're interested in. All right, and then we've got one more scenario. So a different kind of user this time. We'll focus on a local land trust who's operating in the Triad area. And they're interested in understanding how their both current and future conservation work is contributing to their goals. So they'd like to identify areas for future work where different of their priorities align. And they'd also like to make sure they're reporting on their accomplishments to funders in a way that emphasizes those goals and kind of goes beyond just saying the number of acres that they were able to conserve. So we'll jump back to the tools. Starting again with the conservation planner. So here we run this just for the Triad counties, so at the county level, just for the Triad area. And I've picked a few, again, this is a hypothetical, but a few data layers representing conservation benefits that a land trust might be particularly interested in. So they've got kind of a mix here, pollinator habitat and climate resilience, as well as looking at the demand for downstream flood attenuation. So here the models picked out a few different watersheds that are kind of distributed at the margins of these counties, these watersheds. And I think it's interesting here to look at these graphs and see what kind of trade-offs you might be making if you pick projects in one of these watersheds over the other. So for example, there's another trade-off here between how much carbon is currently stored in these watersheds, with Taylor Creek being the highest of the three, and how much is likely to be sequestered in the future, where Taylor Creek is actually the lowest. We can see these kind of trade-offs and all sorts of things. So here's flow and resilience, but they're also kind of this inverse relationship going on. And then pollinator habitat as well, which is one of the benefits we use to prioritize. Taylor Creek scores the lowest in that, whereas the other two high scoring watersheds score a lot higher. All right, and then moving on to the benefits calculator. This is where we get to potential to report on accomplishments to funders. So here, just as a hypothetical, I've uploaded a shapefile that includes multiple properties. So kind of a portfolio of land that's been conserved. This is all land that has been conserved by land trust that's in the Triad counties. It's not by any particular land trust. So it's, again, just a hypothetical, kind of combining all of that conservation that's already happened. And so if you run the tool for this, it will take a little bit longer than the example I showed earlier, because it's got a lot more numbers to crunch for all these properties. But what it ends up giving you is the same summary of benefits. And these are sums across all the properties that you've included. So in total, we've got almost 19,000 acres conserved by land trusts in the Triad counties, and we can get information on each of these benefits as well. And I think this is a good case to also use one of the supporting tools I haven't mentioned that we put together, which we're calling a reporting template. It's linked here. So I'll just open this quickly. This is really just providing a quick way to give context to the numbers that show up from the benefits calculator. So there's a little paragraph written for each of those numbers with blank places for you to slot in your specific results. And it describes what these numbers mean, where the data comes from, and compares your numbers to the averages for the state in many cases to kind of put those in context. So this could be one way to kind of easily describe what your organization is accomplishing in terms of some of these benefits that might be more meaningful to your stakeholders or funders than just acres. All right. Switch back to the PowerPoint for the last time. Thanks for hanging with us through lots of jumping around screens. Hopefully it wasn't too jarring for you all. So I want to make sure we talk about future plans that we have for these tools. We want to emphasize that this is the first version that we're sharing with the public, but we intend to keep updating them in the future and maintaining them so that they stay useful and relevant. So a big part of that will be keeping the underlying data sources updated as new versions of those data sources come out, but also adding new data sets as they become available, especially if they're related to new types of benefits that we haven't been able to include so far. And again, this is tied back to North Carolina's Natural Working Lands Group. And so as there's additional work on that, there might be some data updates or data development related to that planning that we can also pull into this. We're also interested in expanding the functionality in the future, especially if we hear from you that there are certain functions that would be really helpful. So one thing that's already on our radar, for example, is for the conservation benefits calculator, being able to upload a shapefile that has multiple properties and get results for each property as well as the total. But we'd like to hear from you as to what would be most useful, both in terms of functionality, benefits that you'd like to see included, what's working and what's not working for you. So there's a short user survey that's linked at the bottom of both tools and the bottom of the user guide. So if you get a minute to fill that out, whether you've spent lots of time poking around in these tools or you just took a quick look, we would love to hear your experience. And especially if you use any information from the tools, it'd be really great to hear how that worked. Okay, and I just got a question about the climate resilience metric. So that comes from the Nature Conservancy, and that's identifying areas of land that have very diverse microclimates, and so are likely to continue to provide a good habitat for organisms going into the future, even as the climate changes. All right, I think that's everything. Let me just go on to our acknowledgement slide. So this might have been mentioned earlier, but we are funded through the Open Space Institute and Land Trust Alliance, as well as the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. So we really appreciate their support, as well as everyone who participated in our workshops or our surveys as we are figuring out what these tools should look like. So if any of you are on the call, thanks so much. And again, I want to acknowledge Israel Golden as our Google Earth Engine developer. Definitely could not have done this project without him, and I'll bring him on as a panelist in a minute. And with that, we can move into some Q&A. So please feel free to put any questions, comments, concerns, anything into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Thanks.
Hey, Katie, and I just would be remiss if I didn't underscore how fantastic the Nicholas Institute, all your team are in working on this. Thank you so much. We do have a question from someone who came in late. Chris Dreps was asking, are these 14-digit HUC areas? And maybe that's an opportunity for you to say what it is and then explain what that means and why that was chosen.
Yeah, these are 12-digit HUCs, and so they're a little bit bigger than 14 digits. We did consider using 14 digits, and I think that's actually one of the options in the survey that we thought people might want to see in a future update. I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, and Israel, maybe you have an idea of the order of magnitude for this, but I believe there are at least 1,000 times more 14-digit HUCs than 12-digit HUCs in North Carolina. And so our main concern there was that having the information at that scale would slow the tool down too much because it would have to do so much more calculation for that prioritization. But it's definitely something that we can experiment with for a potential future update.
And I think, as I recall, that also drove our decision to come up with that benefits calculator where we could do an individual piece of land, because being constrained to just the HUCs kind of reduced the usefulness in some instances for people. So having both, we thought, answered that question. Yeah, exactly. When we got to thinking about the reporting side of this, we realized that the HUC-12s are not going to be a useful scale to report anything on. And so that's why we ended up adding that second tool. We've got a question about risk of development and what the metrics were for that. So the risk of development data came from the EPA's ICLUS data set, which is basically projecting out land development into the future. And it's based on both climate change and social and economic change. So essentially it's driven by human population projections, which are affected by both social and climate changes. And so we looked basically within each HUC-12 at how much of the either natural lands that existed or working lands that existed were projected to convert to development in that data set by 2050. So it's a kind of medium-term development risk.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the ICLUS data, if you go to it, it's not lumped into working lands and natural lands. Those are some categorizations that we made just by picking through their categories.
Yep, thanks, Israel. If you look at the ICLUS data, it looks like a future land cover data set. So it has all the land cover classes you would expect, and we did some lumping there.
I'm not seeing further questions at the moment. I will say that the sort of narrative tool that's on the website before you go into the actual tools themselves, or the narrative web page, is really helpful and reminds you in a sort of real-time way. You can watch it unfold just like this webinar. So yeah, further questions after you get off, that's going to be a place to go. Yeah, or you can always email me as well if your question isn't answered by looking through that documentation. I'm happy to help, especially if you think you find a bug or something's not working the way you'd expect. Looks like we've got another question about biodiversity. And yeah, this is a great question from Ryan Berry about biodiversity coming in many different forms. And so what is our kind of single biodiversity metric capturing? The biodiversity metric that we're using is from the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program. And they have a biodiversity index that incorporates a lot of the data that they have about imperiled species and identifying really high quality rare habitats that are likely to support rare species. So it does capture kind of these different types of species, different sorts of habitats that exist throughout the state.
but it is still, it's capturing just those aspects of biodiversity, and it's just one biodiversity metric that's in there. So you're right that it's not really giving you a lot of detailed information about what it means if you've got a place that scores high in biodiversity. And that's where some of the other tools that exist in the state, like natural heritage programs, they have some online mapping tools that'll let you see all that detail about species might come in.
I think this is one of those places where if there's a particular metric that a number of you think would be helpful to add to this tool, that's feasible, that might be something we'd love input on. So if there's a different way to look at biodiversity that would be helpful for folks, it'd be helpful to know what that is.
Yeah, definitely. If you fill out the survey, there's a spot for you to add in any ideas you have for other data sets or other metrics that would be useful to see. I think, oh, we got another question here. How does the tool incorporate projections when it comes to different impacts of climate change? That's a great question. It doesn't have any specific climate projections in the tool so far. So that might be something to think about for the future if we could identify parts of the state that might be susceptible to different climate impacts, like changes in precipitation or drought or sea level rise. There's all sorts of things we could potentially look into. Really, the climate aspects of this right now are the carbon metrics, which could be helpful for thinking about projects to try to mitigate climate change. And then the ecosystem resilience metric, in particular, that's identifying these areas that are likely to be continued high quality habitat for species as the climate changes, but that doesn't get to specific changes that we might see on the ground.
I would say if you are interested particularly in seeing changes in coastal systems, we have some other modeling and mapping we've done for coastal North Carolina that we'd be happy to share with anyone who's interested. And we have maps and data for that, but it's not incorporated into this tool.
And you had mentioned earlier that, we have the best we can do for flood impacts right at the moment, but we should remind folks that don't know that the state is undertaking a major modeling exercise. It's going to take a couple of years probably to get to the point that we can make something useful out of it for this, but we will be tracking that, and we want to make sure the most recent flood like data and modeling is part of this in the future.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting work going on in the state that might create some new data sets we'd like to add in the future. And speaking of that, I also just had a question from Pierce Holloway about the potential for extending this, whether we've had any interest from other states in developing similar tools. So I don't know if Chris, do you want to speak about that? I know we've done a little bit of sharing outside of North Carolina so far.
Yeah, we sort of early on at the National Land Trust Alliance rally in New Orleans in September, we did share sort of some of the carbon elements of this as, data as an example. And then we're going in April to the Southeast Land Trust Alliance meeting where we will go more in depth now that we fully finish these. And I think one of the things that our funders have asked us to think about is how might we come up with a way to replicate this process for other states? Because frankly, Israel is fantastic with this, but we know there are other places that have, people with the capacity to do this. And it frankly doesn't in the end cost that much in other states as well. So we'll be talking more about that.
Yeah, and most of the data sets that we used are national scale. And so you could pull them into other states quite easily. And then a few do come from like North Carolina state agencies. And so they are more specific, but my guess would be that most states have something comparable that we could use. So yeah, it should be pretty straightforward to create a version of this for another state if there's interest. All right, I think we've addressed all the questions that have come in so far. Do you have any final questions? I don't want to keep you on longer than needed. If we can wrap up a few minutes early, that would be great. But if you have more questions, we're happy to stay on and chat. All right, well, I'm going to quickly drop the links for both of these tools into the chat, just in case any of you don't have them. And also just a reminder that after this webinar is complete, we will be sending out an email that will have links to the tools, and then we'll also have a recording of this webinar. So if you know anyone who either planned to attend and didn't end up making it, if they registered, they'll get that, or it'll also be available on our website if you'd like to share it more widely. All right, well, let me drop these links in the chat. Thanks again so much, everyone, for joining us. And please, if you do use the tools, take the survey. It'll only take a minute or two, and let us know what you think and if you have more ideas for the future.
Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts about the tools.